Who has been to Red Wagon before? Can I see? All right, so a few folks. So we're a full-scale garden nursery. We grow primarily organic. A lot of what we grow, especially our vegetables, our annual flowers, are all grown from seed. A lot of our herbs as well. And all of the plants that I'm talking about today are plants that we are growing at Red Wagon, and most of them are actually being grown like in 4-inch pots, so pretty small. And it's just a really nice way to fill up your garden really effectively with really beautiful plants that, you know, often self-seed or slowly spread or will just like mound out really nicely. So if you have any other questions about these plants or anything else, I can stay for a few minutes after the class. So the way this will go is we'll sort of talk a bit broadly about medicinal herbs in the garden and why we would be wanting to do that at all. And then we'll take a little bit of a tour through about 11 plants that I particularly love. That is just like a tiny, tiny fraction of the medicinal herbs that we can grow here in Vermont. And that's the other thing. All the herbs I talk about today are herbs that are hardy to Vermont climate. So you don't have to worry about that part. These are all herbs that are going to be just fine in your garden, even if you've got, you know, a windy hillside or something like that. So I would love to see another show of hands. Who here already has a really robust perennial garden? All right, quite a few of you. How many of you are growing maybe more annuals, more vegetables, and you're looking to plant some more long-term perennials in your garden? Okay, a few folks. And who here is already using herbs from their garden to make things like teas or tinctures or infused oils? Great, awesome, that's wonderful. All right, so my hope with this presentation is that as we are in our like garden dreaming and planning and seed selecting phase right now, that all of you will come away from this talk with at least one plant that you want to try out in your garden this year, and at least one plant, whether it's new to you or if it's something you already have growing, that you're going to experiment with using for medicine, even if that just means like nibbling on a leaf or a flower at some point this season. So that's my goal, and you're welcome to stay in touch through Red Wagon or through my website if you want to, you know, send me updates about how your medicinal herb experiences are going this season, because we're just getting started with all of that. We won't have a ton of time to talk about like medicine making specifically, because that's a whole other conversation, how to actually like get the herbs from your garden into your apothecary or your kitchen. You'll notice in that class handout that I sent around, I'm teaching a 4-part series at Red Wagon this year that is focused on medicine making. So like, I have the plants in my garden, now what? So we'll be making tinctures and infused vinegars and drying herbs for tea and stuff like that. And also, you'll notice that there aren't a lot of culinary herbs in this talk, and that's just because they often get a lot of time in the sun anyway. But I just want to sort of give a shout out to things like thyme and oregano and sage and rosemary, which not really perennial in our climate, but all of those herbs that we think of as traditionally culinary herbs are extremely medicinal in their own right. And so if that's all you're growing in your perennial garden right now, you are still very well set up to have like a robust sort of like health-giving garden right outside your front yard. All right, let's just get started. So why grow perennial medicine? Why focus on medicinal plants in the perennial garden? And the first one I want to touch on is just that it's like a very multi-sensorial experience. So a lot of the perennial herbs we're growing in our gardens, they're ornamentals. Many of them have flowers or beautiful leaf color and structure. And so we're often used to enjoying these with our eyes, but I'm inviting us through getting to know these herbs as medicine to start to engage our sense of smell and our sense of taste, because oftentimes, especially if you're getting excited about learning more about herbal medicine, it can be very overwhelming because there are just so many plants and there's just so much you can do with all of them. And there have been books written about medicinal herbs since books have been written. So a way that we can both engage more deeply with the plants in our garden and take away some of that overwhelm is by using a fancy term that herbalists like to talk about called organoleptics. And organoleptics is just using your five senses to better understand the medicinal properties of the plant that you're engaging with. So that can be like, how do you know a dandelion is a dandelion, right? Is it because you look at it? Is it because you smell it? Is it because you taste it? And so in addition to enjoying the perennial herbs in our garden as ornamentals, we're also going to be smelling them, tasting them, and by honing those skills, we can also start to get a better sense of like, wow, this herb is quite aromatic. This lemon balm plant is so aromatic. And I'm also noticing that, you know, this blue vervain plant that I have growing in the wetter part of my garden is not as aromatic, but they taste kind of similar when I taste a leaf or something like that. We start to make these connections around what these plants are good for, what plant families share different characteristics, and we'll talk more deeply about that throughout the presentation. Of course, the other benefit is homegrown healthcare. Learning how to use the herbs that are growing in your backyard or in your garden to take care of, you know, common complaints, you know, tummy troubles or recovering from a cold or flu, or, you know, just making your salad taste a little bit better. These are all incredible ways that we can be using what we have growing to be taking care of our friends, taking care of our loved ones, taking care of our family. In addition to being so useful for humans, these plants often, when we're using them for medicine, we are allowing them to go to flower much of the time, and often if we're harvesting them for their roots, we're letting them go fully to seed. And of course, all the plants we're talking about are perennials. So this provides a lot of food and a lot of habitat for the bugs, the birds, the pollinators. So engaging more with growing these medicinal herbs is also a way to just expand your garden out and welcome in more critters. And I mean, the part that is why I became so enamored with growing medicinal herbs is because once you start, there's no stopping. And I know I'm talking to gardeners, so you know this, right? Once you get into gardening, there's no end to the plant varieties, there's no end to the learning, and this is absolutely true with medicinal herbs as well. So if you have been feeling bored by your perennial garden, or you're looking for, you know, new ways to engage, or you have kiddos in your life and you'd like to get them out into the garden in a really hands-on way, growing medicinal herbs and growing perennial medicinal herbs specifically is just a really long-lasting way to make sure that you will never be bored in your entire life, because you can just go outside and look at the plants and also taste and smell the plants as well. So I want to give one more disclaimer before we sort of like go on our tour, which is that this is all for cultural use, this is all for educational use. I'm not a doctor, I'm an herbalist. There are so many different ways to learn about our bodies and learn about the ways that we can take care of our bodies using herbs. And of course, if you are interested in using anything new long-term for your health, check in with your healthcare provider, herbs included. So without further ado, I'd love to just take us on a tour of the medicinal perennial herb garden. So first and foremost, we have yarrow. Who is already growing yarrow in their garden? Who is growing yarrow on purpose in their garden? And who has yarrow that they didn't plant and it's just there and you're letting it grow? Okay, great. So I start off with yarrow because it's often considered an herbalist's desert island plant. From an herbal perspective, if you only had one plant in your first aid kit or your, home apothecary, this would be a really good one to start with. And like our show of hands showed, even if you don't plant it on purpose, it's probably close by. Yarrow is native to almost the entire northern hemisphere. It's an ancient plant. There have been there's evidence of it found in caves where folks were dwelling, thousands and thousands of years ago. So we know it has been used for medicine for a very, very long time. It is fine in the marginal zones. You often find it growing along gravel driveways or in sandy soil, but if you are actively cultivating it, it is just fine and happy in garden soil. So you'll see this picture is a 3-inch tall yarrow flowering, in a mowed patch of grass somewhere. And then this picture down here is the cultivated yarrow at Foster Farm Botanicals in Calais, Vermont. And you can see that, their yarrow is growing 3 feet tall. I know it's a little fuzzy on the screen, but they're growing like rows and rows of yarrow, and it can easily get to be 3 feet tall, extremely robust. If it's happy, it will self-seed quite readily in your garden. And on the left side, you can see some of the different varieties that we grow at Red Wagon. So I also bring this plant up first because it is a good example of what to do when we're thinking about cultivars of common medicinal plants. So you'll notice on the right side here, the yarrow that's growing is the same yarrow that you would find growing wild out in the world, right? So even though when cultivated it's growing to be quite robust, it is identical to a wild yarrow, so it has all the same chemicals that allow it to thrive and fight off things like pests and diseases in the wild. Once we get into cultivars, for example at Red Wagon, we grow the what they call straight species yarrow, but we also grow things like Sassy Summer Sunset and Sassy Summer Sangria, and they're very beautiful, right? They often have these beautiful orange or red or dark purple flowers, which is an interesting change from the white, or sometimes you'll see some like pale amethyst popping up in the wild yarrow. And if you are growing one of these cultivars in your garden and you're wondering, well, can I use this for medicine? An easy way to test is with what we were talking about before, the organoleptic method, which is, take a little bit of a leaf, crush it up, smell it, take a little flower, you can taste it, and if it smells and tastes the same way that the wild yarrow smells and tastes, which is bitter, floral, slightly astringent, but it has this sort of like complex flavor that once you've tasted it, you'll never really forget that that's what yarrow tastes like. If that's what your cultivated yarrow smells and tastes like, then you can absolutely use it for medicine. However, generally speaking, when we're thinking about cultivars, plants only have so much bandwidth. So if we're selecting for certain traits, like vibrant orange flowers that are really unusual to this plant genus or this plant family, there is a chance that the plant will spend less time on manufacturing some of those constituents that make it a little bit more hardy in the wild and a little bit more useful for medicine. So it's not that you can't use those, it's just that it's important to understand that you might be losing a little bit of the medicinal power with those cultivated varieties. But if they're already in your garden, it's a great way to just start getting excited about using them for something else. And I mean, from my perspective, growing the wild yarrow in your garden, it's so dramatic, just as is. So it's one of my favorite ones to grow. In terms of using it, very easy. You just are cutting the leaves and flowers. You can use just the leaves, or when it's flowering, you can cut that. And often I'll dry it. It dries quite nicely, and then you can powder it up. And it is used. The reason it's Achillea milfolium. We'll sort of go back and forth talking about the Latin. Achillea refers to Achilles, the ancient hero, who allegedly would bring bushels of yarrow into battle so that he could treat his soldiers' wounds with them. So it is very, very successful as a styptic, so stopping the bleeding, and as an antimicrobial. So if you are out in the garden and I have pruned my finger more than I'd like to, and I'm sure some of you have as well. And yarrow has really come in handy for me, just with like basic cuts and scrapes and nicks, powdering it up or making like a poultice of the fresh leaves, putting it on the injury and wrapping it up, and it's really successful at helping to stop that bleeding and helping the wound heal better. So you often will find it in things like gardener's hand salves as well. And that's not all it can do. It's great for all sort of like internal sort of like blood-related things as well. And because we know it's so bitter, you can use it as sort of like a digestive support, generally speaking, as well. So it has a really broad range of uses. And I just want to sort of get us going where it's like, if you do nothing else with this presentation this season, and you just get to know yarrow, you will have done an immense amount of good for your home apothecary. And because it is such an amazing host plant, and it's so beloved by pollinators, you'll be doing right by the birds and the bugs around you as well. So I'm going to move on to another pretty common one. Who's got echinacea growing in their garden? Yes, quite a few. So this one is lovely. It's also native to primarily Midwestern prairies. There are many, many, many echinacea species, and they're all considered medicinal. But Echinacea purpurea is the one that we can actually grow here perennially with a lot of success. Echinacea angustifolia, which is the narrow-leaved echinacea down here, is Echinacea pallida, which is really beautiful, and we do grow that one at Red Wagon as well. But just in terms of creating a wildflower meadow or just a cottage garden, Echinacea is a beautiful one to have. It is also in the aster family, same as yarrow. So that's the same family as sunflowers, and so it's many, many flowers all packed into one flower head, which is part of the reason why pollinators love them so much, because you've got tiny little disc flowers surrounded by these ray flowers that have these beautiful landing pad petals sticking out. Additionally, Echinacea is another one where there's quite a few cultivars on the market right now. You'll see ones with white petals or orange flowers. And again, if you're curious about whether or not it's medicinal, you can take a petal or one of the kind of spiky little disc flowers in the center and nibble on it. And if it makes your tongue tingle a little bit, that is how you know that there's a little bit of medicine in there. So the medicine of Echinacea, maybe some of you have used it before, even just buying it at the health food store or the co-op. It's often used to help boost the immune system. So say you're getting on a plane or you're about to go visit a bunch of snotty-nosed children, or conversely, if you've been sick, you're recovering, and you're trying to just sort of encourage your lymphatic system and your immune system to take out the trash of having a fever and being laid up and all of that. Echinacea is really, really lovely for that. And the parts you use are all parts. So aerial parts, which is the leaves, flowers, stem. When I say aerial parts, I'm just talking about the parts that are in the air, basically. But you also use the root. So what I like to do with Echinacea in my garden is during the growing season, I'll harvest some of the leaves when it's starting to grow and tincture those in alcohol. And then when it flowers, I'll harvest some of the flowers and add that to the tincture. Echinacea does not rebloom very readily, so if you are harvesting the flowers for medicine, you want to make sure that you're leaving a good amount for the pollinators and for your own enjoyment in the garden. The seed heads are also really lovely in the fall, both for winter interest and for the birds to eat. And then in the fall of at least the second year that it has been growing, you can dig up the root and add that to your tincture as well. So you can use any one part. If you have young Echinacea that you don't want to dig up anytime soon, you can just harvest the leaves and flowers. If you have a really established patch, you can dig the root. And when you are harvesting the root, you can cut off the root nodules and the sort of, as it spreads out the legs of the root, and then save the crown where the flower has been coming out and replant that. And as long as you do it with enough before the ground freezes, it can reestablish, and so you can continue to propagate that plant as well. And that's true of most root crops when we're thinking about medicinal herbs that we're taking. Okay, we're going to keep on going, and now we're moving away from the aster family and into the mint family. So raise your hand if you are growing wood betony in your garden.
Growing what?
Wood betony. All right, so we sort of entered into the lesser known plants for the garden, but this is one that I am a huge fan of, and it is one that I encourage you to try in your garden. Wood betony, also known as Stachys officinalis or Betonica officinalis, they're sort of interchangeable. And this is not the same Stachys or Stachys as some of the other ones you might find in the nursery. I think Stachys byzantia is the one that's more like a lamb's ear. It's quite fuzzy. It's not the one that we're talking about. That may be medicinal, but it's not one that I'm familiar with. Wood betony fell out of favor a bit in the classic English country garden, in the medieval garden, in the monastic garden. It was considered extremely important medicine. A famous Italian proverb says, "Sell your coat and buy betony," which gives you a sense of what such high regard that this plant was held in. For a mint, it's extremely tidy. So it does not spread like some of the other mint family plants. The first year, you'll see it grow this nice tidy mound of leaves, and you might get a couple flowers, but it often doesn't flower in the first year. And then the second year, it sends up these tall stalks. They're about 2 feet tall, with these beautiful purple flower heads on top. And so it's wonderful in a front border. It's very traditional, and I think I'd like to say it's having a bit of a resurgence in Western herbalism right now. The parts that you're going to use are also leaves and flowers, so the aerial parts. Another sort of uncharacteristic element of this mint is it doesn't reflower in quite the same way that a peppermint would. If you chop down a peppermint, it's just going to come back twice as strong. Wood betony, you're not going to get nearly as much of a reflower. So it's one that you can pick the leaves off of, you can pick some flowering stalks off of, and you can see each plant sends up quite a few flower stalks, so you can still maintain the sort of look of your garden border by harvesting it for medicine. And in terms of the taste, Maud Greaves, who was a early 20th century herbalist, she wrote A Modern Herbal, volumes 1 and 2. And she was from England. And in regards to the taste, she said, it has somewhat the taste of tea and all the good qualities of it without the bad ones. So what she's referring to there is that the taste of wood betony, it's mild, it's a little earthy, it's ever so slightly bitter, sort of similar to black tea, but it does not have caffeine in it. And if caffeine is the thing that helps sort of get us up and moving in the world, wood betony is really helpful and often used for when we need to bring ourselves sort of back into our bodies. So it's often used for both digestive complaints and nervous system complaints. So the way that I think about wood betony is for folks who maybe get digestion-related headaches. So you're not quite sure what comes first, whether your digestion feels off or the headache comes first. It's often also used for people who feel like they are sort of living outside of their body. And this is an indication, I don't know if anyone here has heard of the doctrine of signatures. It was a method of understanding what a plant is useful for by observing the way it looks. So lungwort, for instance, which is a common garden plant, it's called lungwort because the leaves and the dappled look of the leaves are similar to the human lung, and it was thought to be useful for lung complaints. I like to think of the doctrine of signatures more as like a helpful mnemonic device so that you aren't just having to memorize what all these plants do. So when I see wood betony, I see a sturdy, low-growing clump of leaves that are just very robust, and then this tall stalk, and then this sort of flower head waving in the wind. So for folks who feel like their head and their body are sort of disconnected, it's often used for that. It's just a very good digestive and nervous system tonic, and it's really lovely in tea. So you can just cut the leaves and flowers, or pick the leaves and flowers, dry them, and add them into teas. And because it's such a mild flavor, it combines really well with other mint family plants, as well as other herbs that you might have growing in your garden. Okay, so the next one up are the hyssops. Who is growing anise hyssop in their garden? All right, a few of you. And how about hyssop? Or it's also sometimes called blue hyssop. A few less. Okay, so we're going to go through both of these plants because I think you should be growing both of them in your garden. I think they are both incredible, and they have very different habits. They look very different, but because they both have hyssop in the name, they are often confused for each other when folks are shopping for them. So on the left we have anise hyssop, which is Agastache funiculum, or Agastache rugosa, which is the Korean mint. You can also say Agastache or Agastache. I don't know what the right one is. And then hyssop, which is Hyssopus officinalis. So we'll start with anise hyssop. This plant is also native to North America. It's primarily found in the Midwestern prairies, but it's very, very hardy to Vermont. It's a great herb to grow here. And these are both in the mint family, and they are both cut and come again mints. So you can wait until they have gone to flower, the flowers are just starting to bloom, cut them back to about a foot off the ground, and you'll get at least one, maybe two more flushes of flowers throughout the season. There's also Agastache rugosa, Korean mint, which is a really lovely perennial ornamental. It's usually grown a little further south than here because it's really only hardy to about zone 5. But at Red Wagon, we grow Blue Fortune, or Blue Fortune, which is a hybrid between Agastache funiculum and Agastache rugosa. And I'm growing that in my garden right now. It's doing decently well in a sort of part sun, part shade environment. And the flowers are very similar to regular old anise hyssop, but they're a little bit more on the blue periwinkle spectrum, which is quite nice. And this is a plant, especially if you have kids in your garden, or if you're just a little bit picky about your flavors and you would like the medicine you make to taste good. Anise hyssop is a wonderful one to choose because, just like its name indicates, it is sweet. It has a mild licorice or anise flavor. Often folks who say they don't like the taste of licorice actually find this quite palatable. It's a bit minty, and it dries really nicely, so you can add it into teas. And I like to use it in teas where there might be other strong flavors involved because it helps sort of sweeten and mellow the tea out so it's palatable for everyone, especially kiddos. Even just going by in the garden and taking a leaf and nibbling it, it's just instantly this like sweet, flavorful explosion in your mouth. And anise hyssop is a gentle remedy that's really, really nice for the respiratory system. So it's very soothing, and again, this is a nice one if you've got a kiddo who has a cough. It's a soothing tea to drink to help sort of soften and reduce some of that coughing. And it's useful in the digestive system too, so any sort of, in the same way that our lungs might get irritated and a little scratchy, any irritated digestive stuff is well served by anise hyssop. And generally speaking, you'll hear me talk about the digestive system quite a bit. The mint family, generally speaking, is just really nice for digestion. It's really nice for the digestive system. They're really nice for the nervous system, and that connection between our gut and, you know, our spirit and our emotional state. And then our next one, hyssop, Hyssopus officinalis. You can also call it blue hyssop. Oh, and one thing I didn't mention, so anise hyssop has a very sort of stout habit. It's quite upright. If you plant them en masse, you can make a really nice border or hedge by the second year. It will self-seed. So especially if you're cautious around that, you can just harvest the flowers to prevent that from happening. But the seedlings are very cute. They have these beautiful purple sort of heart-shaped leaves that come up. So they're very characteristic and easy to weed out of your garden if you notice them popping up. But the habit is quite stout and upright, and it doesn't really flop too much. Whereas hyssop has this sort of beautiful, sprawling, almost meadow-like habit. And hyssop is another really classic medicine. It is mentioned in the Bible. It is in almost every, if you go to Europe, it's going to be in almost every monastic garden that you go to. And hyssop is very, very hardy. The story I tell is that I had moved to a new house in Burlington, and I was wandering around the garden, and I found this terracotta clay pot that was probably like a 4-gallon pot that had cracked in numerous places and was being held together by bungee cords. And inside this pot was this hyssop that its roots were directly exposed to the air in the Burlington winter for at least 2 years before I got there. And that spring, it was flowering, it was fine, it didn't need anything. I mean, I took it out of the broken pot and I divided it up and I replanted it in my garden and it did very well. But this plant is incredible. And when you consider how far it's traveled throughout its sort of lifetime around the world, it's really impressive that it does so well here. So I love planting this. As you can sort of see in this picture, it's along a garden path. It will spread, so you want to plant it somewhere where it's not going to get in your way, but it makes a wonderful full sun sort of ground cover if you're looking for something really striking. And these flowers are covered in bees in the high season. They are an absolute bee magnet. And you can let it get to full flower, cut all or part of it back, and it will regrow really nicely. And in all the ways that anise hyssop is soft and soothing and slightly minty and quite sweet, hyssop is pungent, it's stimulating. It has a little bit of floral sweetness to it as well, but spicy is sort of the way I would characterize it. And so hyssop has been used since biblical times for protection. And that protection could be against evil spirits. It could also be against infections, and it's really wonderful for stimulating and clearing the gunk out of your lungs. So if you are in the middle of just a really nasty cold and it feels like there's phlegm everywhere, strong hyssop tea can be really helpful for moving that out. Yeah, it's just a beautiful one, and I really love it, and I would love for more folks to have it in their garden. All right, I'm going to talk about one more mint herb, and then we'll talk a little bit more about ways you can use them as well. Oh, the last thing I wanted to say about hyssop, I remember now. So you notice it's Hyssopus officinalis. Does anybody know what that species name officinalis refers to? So this is a fun way to use Latin to your advantage. If you come across a plant where the species name is officinalis, so previously wood betony, right, it was Stachys officinalis or Botanica officinalis, that lets you know that when Carl Linnaeus in the 1700s was doing the binomial designation where all the plants got a genus and all the plants got a species and they all got put into families, the plants with officinalis were considered to be indispensable parts of the pharmacy of the time in Europe. So, we're talking about 1700s. There were no pharmaceutical pills in the way that we know them now. The pharmacy consisted of herbs compounded in different ways. And so officinalis indicates that this was an herb that was in such high regard as a pharmaceutical herb that it got that specific designation. Not all useful medicinal plants have that designation. It just lets you know sort of where it was and when it was being used in that way. All right, the second to last mint family I'm going to talk about. Who's growing any kind of monarda in your garden? I hope next year you all can raise your hand. These plants are amazing. And so I'm sort of calling them all the bee balms. There are many different monarda plants. To the far left, we have Monarda fistulosa, which is lavender bee balm. In the center is Monarda bradburyiana. On the far right is a little bouquet I made with some fistulosa and Monarda didyma, which is the scarlet bee balm. All the monardas are native to North America generally, but they all have different areas that they were growing. The scarlet bee balm is also known as Oswego tea. And you can see, if you notice, the flowers are these long tube-shaped flowers. So they're quite different from some of the other mint family flowers, and they're elongated. And that lets us know that they are a friend to hummingbirds and butterflies and anything with a proboscis that can get in there to get that nectar. Anyone who's growing them probably will know they are easily thriving in your garden. They can spread quite readily, and they hybridize quite readily as well. So you might have some in your garden that are maybe like a fuchsia color or more of a pink color, and they often are hybridizing. So the monardas are one where even when you go to a nursery, and they might have many different varieties and species to choose from, they usually are the wild species that have just been chosen and selected for their robustness. And this is another one. You're going to be using the leaves, the flowers. You can cut it back, it will keep growing. You can pick the leaves and flowers a little bit at a time if you'd like to dry it for tea or add it to honey or something like that. Even the flowers picked off the flower head and added to salads or sprinkled onto cakes is really quite lovely. That counts as medicine too. If you put flowers on your cake, that is a medicinal cake. And if we're thinking about anise hyssop, blue hyssop, and the bee balms in a sort of spectrum of spiciness, many of the Monardas are going to be the spiciest ones, specifically lavender bee balm, Monarda fistulosa. And so they have a beautiful floral taste, and the flowers are a little more mild than the leaves, but that spiciness, similar to the hyssop, will be really helpful for moving phlegm in the body, helping to fight off infection. If we think about hyssop as being the sort of spicy, pungent, protective herb of Western Europe up until very recently, you can consider the Monardas as being the spicy, pungent, protective herb of North America. And it has extensive use, obviously, by the populations who have lived here for the longest time. So we can learn a lot from them, and we can use it in similar ways to those that we understand from using other spicy mint family plants. I really love if you combine these three, the Monardas, the hyssops, and the anise hyssops, dry those, combine them in a tea with a nice dollop of honey. You feel like nothing could get you. It's very lovely. And you can, adjust the proportions depending on who you're giving the tea to, right? A little bit more anise hyssop if it's for a child, if it's for someone who can, take a bit of loosening of the mucus. I'm sorry if you didn't know you were going to a garden conversation and they were going to use the word mucus, but so they're really, really easy to grow. These especially, because they spread, they're wonderful. You can see them with some black-eyed Susans in that one picture. They're lovely in sort of more naturalized gardens, but if you're willing to sort of corral them, you can have them in a more sort of tidy area. And this is the last mint I'll talk about. And it is neither spicy nor beautiful, but it is one of my favorites, and so I wanted to put it in here for you. Skullcap. Does anyone have skullcap growing in their garden? Okay. Does anyone have an area that they're gardening or spend time in that is maybe a little bit wet and a little bit wild and maybe on the edge of a stream or a forest or somewhere where it's getting partial shade, things like that? Okay, so skullcap is one of our native mints. It is not aromatic by any stretch of the imagination. The flavor is very mild, a little bit bitter, and this is a plant that you will find growing wild around here. I have found it growing along the Waterbury Reservoir. I've found it sort of tucked in the fields in the unmowed areas of the Innervale in Burlington, and it is not particularly, what's the word? I want to say something nice about it. It's not showy, let's say that. It has these small little flowers. It's sort of like if you took a hyssop and shrunk it down, and it is really adaptable to those wetter areas, those part shade areas, and it would make my heart sing if everyone who was considering letting the apple mint or the peppermint that they stuck in that weird wet corner of their yard go wild, if you put skullcap there instead, because it's native, the insects know what it is. It's a lovely way to add small but very useful flowers to like a marginal area, a shady area. If you have a nice rich garden soil for it, it will love that. It will do just fine. And this plant is a plant that many, many people can benefit from. I have benefited very gratefully from this plant. Skullcap, sort of similar to wood betony, and I've actually used it together for folks quite a bit. It's a wonderful plant for people whose minds are buzzing around like bees. So let's say, I'm sure this isn't true for any of you, maybe when you go to sleep, you're having a hard time sleeping, and the reason you're having a hard time sleeping is because you are thinking about what happened that day and what happened the day before that, maybe what's going to happen tomorrow. Maybe you're making a list of all the things you're going to need to do the next day. Maybe you're thinking about that thing that that person said, what did they mean by it? And you're ready for bed, but your mind just won't turn off. So enter skullcap. It's not sedative. It is not going to knock you out. But for folks who have that racing feeling in their mind, it's really helpful for just putting the lid on it. I think of it as, you know, when you've got a pot that's starting to boil and everything's just jumping around a little bit and maybe the lid is starting to jiggle a little bit and rattle around, you just get the lid on tight. It's also really lovely for folks who just have like some musculoskeletal tension. So maybe your mind isn't always racing, but you just, you know, it feels like your shoulders are a little tight all the time, your muscles are a little tight all the time. It's very gently relaxing to the muscles. So this is a plant I find many people in my clinical practice and in my life benefit from. I have benefited from it quite a bit. You know, I've taken skullcap before hosting a dinner where I felt myself just starting to, you know, move the silverware around on the table for the sake of moving the silverware around, and needed to just be able to enjoy the fact that I was about to have a bunch of people come to visit. There are many, many other Scutellaria species, so you can absolutely explore some of those. Scutellaria bicolensis is one that is native to the Baikal region of Siberia. There are skullcaps that are native to almost the entire northern hemisphere, but Lateriflora is the one that is native to where we live right here. Okay, we'll pick it up a little bit. Who's got meadowsweet growing in their garden? All right, a few of you. We've got a few different meadowsweets that you can choose from. It's the Filipendula genus. So Filipendula ulmaria, which is from Western Europe on the left, is queen of the meadow. And Filipendula rubra, which is native to Eastern North America here, is called queen of the prairie and has this beautiful pink flower. There are many other Filipendulas. There are spireas as well that are closely related, that are native to our area. Generally speaking, this genus ranges in sizes anywhere from 3 feet to 8 feet tall. They tend to like full sun. They tend to like pretty rich soil. They can handle a little bit of moistness in the soil. And the parts that you're going to be using for medicine are leaves and flowers. I know on the right, the Filipendula rubra that we're growing at Red Wagon, it also makes a beautiful, the seed heads are really beautiful in cut flower arrangements and everlasting bouquets and things like that. So this is one that they grow so tall and majestic that you can harvest very little of the plant and end up with quite a bit of medicine for yourself. The taste is a little bit tannic, so you know that the feeling if you drink some black tea without milk in it, or some dry wine, and that you sort of feel the inside of your mouth pucker a little bit. That's that tannic feeling. And all medicinal plants in the rose family generally have some of that astringency, that tannic bite to them. And so the meadowsweets, additionally to that tannic feeling, have a sort of menthol, minty flavor, and they're very mildly bitter. So you can add them to teas, and they are historically used for pain and inflammation, especially in the digestive system. The source of, so in, I believe it was, when was it, 18 something, the salicylic acid was isolated from the meadowsweet plant and converted into salicin, which is where aspirin comes from. So aspirin comes from spirea, which is another one of the genus names. So we know, based on the way that it's been used for pharmaceutical medicine, that the meadowsweet genus generally is very useful for pain. Of course, when you're taking leaves and flowers, you're thinking about it on a more tonic, long-term sort of use rather than popping an aspirin and hoping for relief in 20 minutes. But it mixes well into tea is primarily the way that I've used it. And they're just very beautiful in their garden. They're extremely striking plants, especially if we're talking about skullcap as being a little bit more marginal. the meadow sweets are really going to take center stage. However, if you're like, well, let's go back to talking about plants that can do well in part shade, moist locations, because I don't have rich soil and room for a 6-foot tall meadow sweet plant. May I introduce you to Lady's Mantle? Yeah. Raise your hand if you're growing Lady's Mantle. Yes. Raise your hand if you started with one Lady's Mantle and now have many more Lady's Mantle. You can give some to some of the other folks here. So Lady's Mantle is also in the rose family. And again, when we're starting to meet these plants and we're making connections both by smelling and tasting and looking at them, but also by learning about their history, where they come from, what family they're in, it's just like getting to know a new person so you can make a good friend. So I don't really expect you to make 11 new best friends this season, but I'm just sort of introducing you to all of them, and I hope that one catches your eye. You think, oh, I can get to know Lady's Mantle a little bit more. It's already everywhere in my garden, so might as well. So we have a few different species of Alchemia. There's vulgaris, Alchemia mollis, and it's a very common ornamental plant, especially for the border. It can absolutely handle shade. The flowers make beautiful cut flowers for bouquets, even though they can, the stems aren't super long. And it's called Lady's Mantle because we have these ridged leaves that represent the mantle or cape of a lady, as it were. So again, you're using the aerial parts, so you're cutting the leaves and the flowers of this plant, and it has a very similar flavor to the meadowsweet, just without that like minty menthol taste. So again, it was historically used to treat wounds and ulcerations, both internally and externally. This is another one that has been used for a very, very long time. The reason it's called Alchemia is because the ancient alchemists used to use not necessarily the plant, but the dew that collects in the cup of the leaf for their alchemical preparations. I have never done that before, but I will say, if the only way you use plant medicine this year is by slurping some dew off of a lady's mantle leaf, that counts, and that is probably good for you. It definitely feels good while you're doing it. So this is another one. Let's say you have a bruise, a break, a sprain, and you're trying to just like help the wound heal. You can make a lady's mantle tea and like soak your ankle or your wrist or something like that in that. Okay, we've got just 2 more plants. We'll sort of fly through them. New England aster. I'm sure all of you are familiar with this plant. If not in your garden, then just in the fall when we're watching things start to die back and suddenly the New England aster blooms in all of its beautiful, beautiful purple glory. You can see it there with its friend the goldenrod, who often blooms alongside, who is also really good medicine. If we're all planting skullcap instead of non-native mints for our like marginal wetlands, let's all plant New England aster species or varieties instead of chrysanthemums for our late fall color. Perennial chrysanthemums are in the same family, right? They're both in the aster family. But the New England aster is really critical as a late season nectar source for migrating insects and for insects that are getting ready to hibernate. So the more asters we have, the better. There are many, many different genuses of asters that are native to this area, but New England aster specifically is, gorgeous, quite showy, and there are many different colors that you can get if you're at nurseries. So if you're looking for, pink New England aster or a more pale purple, just make sure you check to make sure that it's a true species and not cross. Especially when we're thinking about our native plants, it's really important to, whenever possible, go for the true species over the cultivar, because that's what all of the symbiotic relationships that these plants have are based on. So you can use all parts of this plant. My only experience is using the flowers, and they're really, really relaxing to the lungs. So if you have recently got over an illness and you've used hyssop, all the phlegm has come out, and there's nothing more there, but you maybe still have a scratchy cough or an unproductive cough, or it's maybe causing you a little bit of like abdominal pain, or it's making it hard to go to sleep at night. New England aster, either in a tincture or a vinegar, or if you just stuff a bunch of the flowers into a jar, cover it with honey, put it in a warm place and infuse that honey, mix that into some hot water, that can be quite nice. I won't suggest using it as a tea, just because if you try to dry the flowers, much like the other asters, if you let them dry, they will just sort of poof into many tiny seeds, and what was once a tray full of beautiful purple flowers will just be like a bunch of white dust, basically. So they're best used in fresh preparations. But this is one that I'm exploring more. It's really lovely. You can just take a flower and nibble on it. They don't taste great. They're a little bit acrid, and not spicy so much as just a little pungent in the mouth. But it's not unpleasant, and when you feel that relaxing effect that it has on the lungs, it's really, really wonderful. All right, one more, and then I'm ready for questions. Black cohosh, I wanted to mention, I didn't want to not mention this plant because I think it really describes the trifecta of plants that are well used as ornamentals. It's native to this bioregion, so it's a wonderful one to add to your garden. And it has, since it has been started to be used in more pharmaceutical preparations, it has a really strong history of research and use both on this continent and in Europe, although it is native to here, for its medicinal properties. So this is Actaea racemosa or Simisafuga racemosa. You can use both. It's in the ranunculus family, which is not one we've talked about, and not necessarily a family that is across the bar, safe to use, right? The rose family and the mint family are generally extremely safe. The ranunculus, please don't eat any other ranunculuses until you've done your due diligence. Anyway, who has black cohosh growing in their garden? So a few of you. So it's happy in the woods, it's happy in rich soils and part shade, but if you put it in full sun, you get these huge, huge flower spikes that the insects adore. They are great in a cut flower or as a dried seed head. And the parts that you're primarily using are the roots and the rhizomes. It does not taste good. I would not suggest a tea. You could do it. It's often used as a tincture. And this one is also used for spasm. So it could be lung spasm, that sort of like dry cough that we were talking about with the New England aster. Also for things like back pain and leg pain, and has traditionally been used both by native folks, modern herbalists, and in the sort of pharmaceutical industry at this point for a variety of hormonal issues. And this is one also, if you're interested in using it for medicine, because it is native to this area, having a cultivated patch that you are harvesting because you are using the roots and the rhizomes is a much better idea than going out into the woods and harvesting wild, because many of our wild woodland natives that are highly medicinal are now at risk of thinking about things like golden seal, ginseng, things like that. So this one is a little bit more adaptable and quite a bit easier to grow than those, but has a lot of medicinal power. All right, that was just a tiny sampling of the herbs that you can grow in your garden. So I've left a few here as well. Things like goldenrod, which is also native and grows quite abundantly in the wild. Things like raspberry leaves, which you might be pruning out of your garden pretty soon. Things like Solomon seal, which is another native woodland shade-grown plant. Rose flowers, elecampane, and marshmallow. So this is just another small smattering of the herbs that I love to grow in my perennial garden. And I can come back to this slide too. So here we've got some violas. So that's it. I would love to answer some questions as well. And if anyone needs me to go back to a different slide so they can catch some more info. I know it was sort of like a quick tour through the garden. But if you're interested in learning more, we are doing the classes at Red Wagon. We're going to be talking a lot more about different medicinal plants and what to do with them once they're in your garden. And I'm doing a variety of other classes throughout the year, all over the state, in Charlotte, in Danville, in Burlington. So please get in touch if you're interested in doing more. Thank you all so much.
Thank you. Any questions? Anyone have any questions?
Does Bethany have a square stem like the other ones?
It sure does, yes. All the mints. Square stem, opposite branching leaves, similar flowers. Yeah. Even though you don't see the leaves take a break up the stem, so it doesn't look as characteristic. Absolutely, yeah.
And your open house at Red Wagon is?
Right, so this Saturday we have a fun like spring preview red tag sale at Red Wagon. That's a benefit for the Heinsberg Resource Center. And then April 1st is our open house. And April 14th, we are officially open to the public every day, 8 to 6. So you're welcome to come on by. April 14th.
And what is the red tag sale?
Oh, good question. I didn't know either. In addition to all of our tools and houseplants and seeds and things, we it's like the garage sale for Red Wagon. So we're opening up the vaults, and there's going to be vintage garden books and tools and pots and things like that. So if you're looking to stock your garden a little bit more for the season, that's what we'll have. Yeah. Do you have a question?
Would you go back to the previous slide that had the rest of the
Sure
things?
thing. Yeah. Yeah, go ahead.
Yes. Is there anything that goes particularly well in clay?
Ooh, yes. Things that can handle clay, and speaking from experience, both as someone who has gardened in Shelburne and Heinsberg is completely clay. A lot of the things that can do well in clay can also just do well in those like swampy, heavy areas. So valerian is just fine, angelica is just fine. Skullcap does pretty well as well. They don't necessarily want to dry out completely. So if you've got the kind of clay that like turns to cement when it dries out, but once they're established, they really don't mind. And anything with a long taproot, of which many of these medicinal plants have, is going to be better suited to clay because it can really tunnel through and establish itself. So yeah, elecampane, marshmallow, valerian, angelica, those are all things we use the roots for. They all tend to be a bit taller as well because they are really well suited to like areas that might flood once in a while. Another great one that I didn't put on this list is bone set. That will do just fine in clay and is in the aster family, has really beautiful, really beautiful white cluster flowers as well. Yeah. Does somebody else have anything over here? Yeah. Ooh, that's a great question. A good herbal medicine book. There are so many, so it kind of depends on what you're looking for, but the godmother of Western herbalism also lived in Barrie for a very long time, Rosemary Gladstar. So she has quite a few wonderful books. Medicinal Herbs for Vibrant Health, I think is one of them. And then I forget what the other one is, but it's got like a purple and brown cover. Those ones I really love. Other folks, I'm happy to take folks' emails if you want me to send you a list of great books for if you're trying to learn more. Jim McDonald is also someone he's out based in the Midwest, but similar bioregions, so he knows a lot of the same plants that we do. And he has a lot of great information specifically on his website, a lot of his writings. So he doesn't have a book out yet, but. And then Maud Greaves, who wrote The Modern Herbal, that one's a wonderful reference book as well. And then Rico Czech, his last name is CSEH, who runs Strictly Medicinal Seeds out in Oregon, which is where a lot of folks get their medicinal herb seeds. He has quite a few books both on growing and using medicinal herbs. Yeah. Yeah.
I have some mallow. Is that the same as marshmallow?
Great question. What color are your mallow flowers?
Pink.
Like a bright pink? Like a pale pink?
What's that?
Like a pale pink?
I would say, yeah.
Okay. So there are a lot of different mallow family plants. That also includes things like hibiscus and altheas and malvas both. It might not be the same as marshmallow, but they all can be used interchangeably. So generally speaking, all of the althea and malva plants, you can use their aerial, like their leaves and flowers as well as their roots, and they tend to be really soft and soothing and a little bit slimy when you steep them into water. So they're really good for soothing the respiratory system, soothing the digestive system. Those are some of my favorite plants. Yeah. But I'd have to see an actual picture to
I just
idea.
know it's seeds everywhere.
Yeah, it could be, yeah. But there are a lot of other ornamental malvas and altheas that get sold that are not marshmallow but have very similar habits to the marshmallow, yeah.
Curious, where the chief plant in the room got its training, namely do.
Oh, thank you for asking. I didn't mention that at the beginning. So I've been studying herbs for about 10 years. I've had a few different teachers. I went through the clinical herb program at Vermont Center for Integrative Herbalism, which is based in Montpelier, and now in Plainfield. So that was a 3-year training program. But there's a lot of really great places around here. I've been living in Vermont since 2007, so basically all of my plant training has been here. So there's down in, outside of Brattleboro, in South Newfane, Julia Abigail Carr has a beautiful United Plant Savers designated medicinal forest and garden, and she does classes down there. Up in Burlington, there's Spoonful Herbals, and they have an apprenticeship. And then, yeah, Vermont Center for Integrative Herbalism has both online and in-person workshops, and then their longer year-long programs as well. Yeah.
Do you have those references on your website?
I do, yes. Yeah, I'll go back to that quickly. So yeah, Patchwork Plant Medicine is my website. I have a whole page full of references around where you can buy herb seeds if you haven't found them, different writings that I've done for Red Wagon, and other herbalists and herbal organizations that I really love. And I love getting emails, so feel free to send me an email at sophie@patchworkplantmedicine.com if you are interested in learning more, or email me at the Red Wagon Plants email, and I can send you book recommendations and things like that. Yeah. Okay. Thank you all so much.
I would like to mention one thing. We do have a plant sale. Our garden club does have a plant sale every year, and we take donations for the plant sale, and then we also invite you to come and buy plants at the plant sale. And that is the first Saturday in June, is that right? First Saturday in June on the green in Middlebury. So,